Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and if some of the science fiction you've been reading recently has been rather dark or bleak, perhaps that's my bad. But I know that you sometimes might be in the mood for something a little bit more humorous. So today I have for you 8 comedic sci-fi books. And I've broken down each of these books into different categories. So whatever your sense of humor or the type of comedic sci-fi that you're looking for, hopefully there's a book on this list that will be right for you. So let's get started with our first category, absurdist sci-fi, for which I picked Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. Breakfast of Champions follows the science fiction writer Kilgore Trout that meets a car dealer that thinks his fiction is actually truth. So this is a rather meta book, as we kind of have a novel within a novel, and it deals with themes including free will. For example, are we all just characters in somebody else's novel? The sense of humor in this one is pretty ridiculous, as we have things like farting, tap dancing aliens, and a series of drawings by Vonnegut himself that can only be described as artistic masterpieces. Vonnegut himself described this book as something along the lines of getting all the silliness out of his head. And for me, this isn't quite a top-tier Vonnegut book, as on an emotional level, I didn't quite connect to it as much as some of my favorite works of his, but if you're looking for something that is satirical, something that is completely absurd, then Breakfast of Champions might just hit for you. Alright, for our next category, I'm calling this one Cynical Seniors, with the book Old Man's War by John Scalzi. So something kind of fun and unique about this story is that the main characters are elderly citizens. It is a military sci-fi book where Earth is at war with aliens, and we have recruits that go through training in order to travel to fight these wars. But the twist is, rather than recruiting young soldiers, the military recruits older people, people that are wise, that have life experience, and then they give them young, fresh, battle-ready bodies. So it's a really interesting dynamic seeing these older characters in a fresh and new setting for them. And a lot of these older characters have kind of a dry sense of humor. They're a little sarcastic, they're a little jaded, a little cynical, and I found the dialogue between them to be rather entertaining. For me, the tone was a little bit similar throughout the book, so while I did enjoy it, I haven't felt compelled to read more in the series, just in case it started to feel a little bit too much of the same thing. But if you like military sci-fi, if you like a book with a premise like The Forever War, but you want to combine that with a little bit of comedy, some unique older characters, some unique perspectives, then Old Man's War. It does all those things. Alright, and just before we get to our next book, at the end of the video, I will be spinning the Quantum Wheel in order to find out what book will be our patron pick of the month. So stick around to the end of the video for that. Moving on to our third book, we have a category that I've called Science Jokes, and for this I have picked The Martian by Andy Weir. In The Martian, we have an astronaut named Mark Watney, who is on a space mission where anything that can go wrong does go wrong, and he has to use his knowledge of maths and science in order to survive, as well as his sense of humor in order to stay sane. The book is written in a first-person POV, so we really get inside Mark's head, and he's a pretty smart and funny guy. He can be a little bit crude at times, nothing over the top, but if you are picking this book up for perhaps someone of a younger age group, maybe start with Project Hail Mary, as it has a similar style by Andy Weir, but that one keeps things pretty PG. A lot of the jokes Mark makes are regarding his own impending death, or the science that he is using in order to try and avoid said death. This book taught me so much more about things like dust storms and growing potatoes than I ever expected from reading a book called The Martian. It's a super fun read with a lot to enjoy, whether you are newer to science fiction or an experienced sci-fi reader. So wherever you are on that spectrum, if you haven't picked it up yet, I think it's worth a try. Okay, for our next category, we have one that I'm calling Trope Level 9000, and for this I have picked Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. So what I mean by this is, if you are looking for a book that is not only not afraid to lean into some tropes, but you want them to take those tropes and dial them all the way up to 11, that is what Snow Crash does with the subgenre of cyberpunk. It's super stylized, it's super over the top, but it's also really well thought out. I've heard some readers pick this up and ask the question, is this supposed to be serious or is it supposed to be silly? And I think the answer is both. Snow Crash combines some rather prescient predictions for future technology with a rather interesting historical fiction storyline. And it takes these two things together and it presents them in a kind of cool, kind of corny package. Yes, it is famous for a character doing a terrible rap, but you just have to accept that this book combines the highly intellectual with the kind of dumb. And for some people, either none, one, or both of those two things are going to hit. You just have to try it out for yourself. And moving on to our next category, we have quippy characters, for which I have picked Deathstalker by Simon R. Green. Deathstalker is a sci-fantasy sword and planet space opera, and there's a lot of things that I like about it, including some of the sci-fi ideas, as well as the world building. But for me, something that stands out is just how much personality the characters have. The banter is great and the dialogue is witty. And something that I enjoyed was just how quickly I felt like I got to know the unique personalities of each of these characters. If anything, just from the introduction of them by name, characters such as Valentine Wolf or Owen Deathstalker, you already kind of get a sense of what they're going to be about, and seeing the dynamics between each of these fun characters was just a delight to read. I think this one is a little bit underhyped, and I'm actually going to be reading the sequel, Deathstalker Rebellion, later this month. So if this sounds up your alley, please join me on Team Deathstalker. Okay, moving on, we now have what might be a little bit of a polarizing category, and that is dad jokes. And for this one, I have picked We Are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor. Now you might be thinking that dad jokes sounds like an insult, and if you're a dad, you might be thinking that it's the highest form of compliment. It can go both ways. We Are Legion, We Are Bob is a little bit similar to The Martian in the sense that we follow a first-person POV, and our main character one day gets hit while crossing the road and wakes up and finds out that his mind has now been uploaded into a computer and that he has possibly been selected to go on a space mission. So he has to use his understanding of various sciences in order to perhaps get chosen for this mission, and also use his sense of humor to avoid going insane after realizing that he is now software. This book has a lot of jokes to do with technology and science, as well as quite a lot of pop culture references. For me, it really straddled that line between being funny and being cheesy, and what a fine line that can be. I think if this is your sense of humor, or you're just in the mood for that kind of thing, We Are Legion, We Are Bob can be a really enjoyable reading experience. Okay, and for our second last category, we have one that I'm simply calling British humor, and of course for this I have picked Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. This is arguably the gold standard for comedic science fiction, and there are a lot of words that you could use to describe this book's sense of humor. You could call it dry, clever, creative, dark even, but I think the word that sums it up the best is British. I think if you could somehow wipe from my memory any understanding, knowledge, or context for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I picked it up and read it, I'm pretty sure that I would know it was British. I'm not an expert on British comedy, but I was actually born in England, and then when I was 6 years old, my family moved to Australia. So my parents introduced me to some things like Monty Python and Fawlty Towers, and then when I was a bit older on my own, I found things like The Thick of It and Peep Show. And I definitely don't think you need to be British in order to enjoy it, as this book is certainly wildly popular all over the world. I'm just saying that if you have tried some British comedy before, and it either worked for you or it didn't, and that's sort of informing whether you think you want to try Hitchhikers or not, you're probably right, as I think this is quintessentially British comedy. And if you're not sure one way or the other, give it a go. It's Hitchhikers. Alright, for our eighth and final comedic sci-fi book, I've picked the category of robot protagonists. And for this category, I've chosen Sea of Rust by C. Robert Cargill. So often in science fiction, we get funny robots as side characters. Well, in Sea of Rust, there has been an apocalypse, and there is only robots left. Robots are the main characters. Now, this book, I would say, is more of an action book than a comedy book, but some of the robots can be pretty funny, and there's some rather interesting set pieces in a kind of an action comedy style that I found to be rather entertaining. The author, C. Robert Cargill, actually wrote the screenplay for Doctor Strange, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of his style, although I would say this book takes some slightly bigger swings, as it isn't overly edgy, but it can get away with a few more things than you might be able to do in the MCU. If you like stories with action sequences followed by a character delivering a one-liner, but that character just happens to also be a robot, then Sea of Rust might be the book for you. So there you go, guys, those are 8 comedic sci-fi books. Let me know what you think are some of the funniest sci-fi books in the comments below. And just quickly, before we go, if you're interested in finding out what I'm going to be reading this month in the month of February, stick around as I spin the Quantum Wheel. Welcome to the Quantum Wheel, where all of the patron picks are both picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Let's see if we will stay on brand, stay on theme with a light and humorous patron pick, or whether this will go off the rails with something dark and terribly bleak. A big wheel this month, lots of great choices to pick. What is it going to land on? Blood Music maybe will tick over. Blood Music hangs on. This was a popular choice. A few patrons teamed up to vote for Blood Music, so I'm sure some people will be happy about that. A lot of great comments on the channel recently about Blood Music, so join me in February. We're going to read it. Greg Bear. Let's find out what it's all about. Not comedic though. Pretty sure a book named Blood Music's not that comedic. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs like Nima and New Eden, Half Ogre, Zakaway, and Colin, who's not in a laughing mood. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.